Well, the next speaker needs no further introduction, really. He's been a really busy presenter yesterday on a panel, workshop, and now this morning. So will you again please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Lichtenberg. Thank you. Oh, yeah. There we go.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Paul. Are we good, Glenn? There we go. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to have been part of this conference. I, too, have learned a great deal and taken away a lot of things to follow up on. So it's really been very exciting for me. And now I'm delighted to share our story a little bit. I want to talk to you a little bit about our journey in this area of financial decision-making and financial exploitation. I want to review for you some of the domains of financial exploitation, what we've learned piece by piece with some of our own research on fraud and predictors of fraud, how we went about creating new financial decision rating scales, and yeah, the proof is somewhat in the pudding, some of our empirical studies to try to validate these efforts, and then a little bit about training and implementation. It's always a challenge to get people to adopt new ways of doing things, and we found some good hands-on approaches that seem to be beneficial. Finally, we'll end up just briefly mentioning our website. On our website are narrated e-learning training modules. By October 1st, we'll have all 4 modules up, 3 scales. There's no charge for any of this. People can get trained and certified on the site. So let's start with a case example, because it really describes sort of what the hole was, where the gap was. This did not take place in Tennessee. This took place in a northern state. A former university professor was gifting his grandson to the tune of about $300,000 in 1 year. There was a Adult Protective Service request. They went out and interviewed the guy. He was still teaching a class every now and then. He seemed just fine. I mean, he seemed more than fine. It seemed like he was an example of aging successfully. Conversationally, he was perfect. I can't remember, maybe they gave him an MMSC or a MOCA, and he scored great. Maybe they asked him, hey, have you been gifting your grandson? And he said, yeah, sure. So they went away. And it was the police department that actually called them and said, we really think there's something wrong here. Would you go back out and do a little bit more investigation? That's when I got a call because the director of this APS had been to our workshop, and she said, hey, can I use your tool in this case? And she went back out, and it turns out that this gentleman had mild cognitive impairment and significant memory problems, and he wasn't really tracking this. He thought he had given his grandson about $1,500 across a 12-month period. So right there, they were able to stop the exploitation and really move on with it. What was missing was a way of informed decision-making. So really, the dark side of financial capacity assessment is financial exploitation. And in these instances, I'm including cases where there's an interaction between the older adult victim and another, quote, trusted person. Ken Conrad, Mickey Iris, and their colleagues used a very sophisticated concept mapping method to kind of explicate the domains of financial exploitation. And really, the end result is either a theft or a scam. But the mechanisms could be abuse of trust, financial entitlement, coercion. Financial entitlement, I think, is something that is rampant and very pernicious. It goes something like this. I'm helping my mom. I take her to the doctor. I think, hey, not only should I get reimbursed for my gas mileage for taking her, but I should probably get reimbursed for my gas mileage for the rest of the month, for whatever I do. After all, that's my inheritance. Now, you and I, because we're in this field and we have common sense, we would call that theft. But there are many people that truly believe that they're entitled to that money of their older parent. And one very tragic consequence of this is that money is a taboo topic, and that very rarely are older adults going to talk to their adult children about their finances. As a matter of fact, in some studies, they found that older adults consider it a greater risk than benefit to talk to their adult children about finances. Problem is, and our studies have found this too, people get lonely. They want to talk about their money. They're worried about their finances. So they end up talking to some of the wrong people. A couple other domains were signs of exploitation, money management difficulties. But none of the items for this scale, as good a scale as it is, looked at judgment or decision making. Nothing to help assess whether the transfer of funds, such as cases we just heard about, were really an authentic decision on the part of the older adult. How much is there? We heard the figure of 10% this morning, and that's probably more right. I give the Department of Justice a great deal of credit because they are the ones that started funding financial exploitation studies that really began to raise the awareness. And they funded a researcher named Ron Asierno, and he did a prevalence study across the country, probability sampling and so forth. And across 12 months, 5.2% report financial exploitation. This was the second most common form of elder abuse, second only to psychological abuse. 60% was misappropriated by family. And some of the predictors were things that you would expect, things that make older people vulnerable: dependency, activities of daily living dependency, and the non-use of social services, or that isolation factor. Other studies have also found things like depression to be related. In the last couple of years, there was a meta-analysis done on financial fraud and scams to try to look at the prevalence there. And a lot of it depends on how you ask the questions. So just on fraud and scams alone, this group also found an average of about 5% per year. In our studies, we actually learned a good lesson about the importance of psychological vulnerability. We took a nationally representative sample from the Health and Retirement Survey sub-study, and we had somehow gotten them to think about fraud, and they included a couple of questions. Have you been defrauded across the last 5 years, other than theft? Now, this nationally representative study is conducted every couple of years, so we were able to go back to years prior to the look-back period and see if anything predicted whether somebody became defrauded. We had a couple of publications on this, and what we found was that psychological vulnerability was a big factor. Now, in these kinds of survey studies, you're not getting people with significant dementia. So this is the cognitively well sample, if you will. Might be some cognitive decline in some folks, but essentially the cognitively well. And psychological vulnerability, which really was a combination of high level of depression and a very low level of feeling like they still had social status in society. Predicted the rate of fraud at 2 to 3 times the rest of the population. We've heard throughout the conference, anybody can be defrauded, and this study showed that as well. But some people are more vulnerable to becoming the victims of fraud and scams. And we thought, to date, so much of thinking about financial capacity has been about cognition. And the psychological factors are really important. Now, we've heard about undue influence, and another word for it in the financial exploitation domain is coercion. But what is it? How would you look at it? How would you assess it? Really, undue influence is the loss of free will by an older adult. As my attorney friends love to remind me, we all influence each other, and it's okay. We're allowed to do that. It's when that influence becomes undue and substituting my will for somebody else's free will. I can do that a lot of ways. I can be a flatterer. I can be a persuader. I can be a threatener. I can do all of that together. I can simply kind of break down an older adult if I get that kind of access. Now, there's a couple of models that I've used in evaluating. These are both national models. One comes from the California law and the Susan Burnett's scam model. Anybody familiar with it at all? Well, good. Here's a good model to think about. The S is for susceptibility. And we really can think of 3 things: cognitive impairment, psychological vulnerability, functional dependency. Meet any of those 3 and you have susceptibility. The C is for confidential relationship. Isolation, total dependence, at least around finances, on one person becomes the norm here in a lot of these cases of coercion, undue influence. And there's often in this confidential relationship a lot of poisoning the relationship with others for the older adult. Telling lies, basically. I had one case where a mother lived with her son. Her son was stealing from her. Her son was convicted of stealing from her. When I evaluated her, she was still convinced that her other son was the thief, even though he was totally innocent and was helping her out. Why? She'd become the victim of undue influence of the son who lived with her. He had poisoned that relationship so much. One factor in dementia that people overlook is how easy it is to make someone with dementia paranoid about another person. And you know what? We're always paranoid about the person we depend on the most, and that's the caregiver themselves. The A is for active procurement. What do we do? How can we look at this? All of a sudden, I'm the one calling the bank. I'm calling the attorney. We need to make some document changes here. I'm taking mom to some appointments and not to others. I've taken over kind of all the bill paying. Active procurement. We want to look at the steps that are taken, and then, of course, the monetary loss, the actual events that happened. Now, the California law asks that anybody claiming undue influence provides information on these 4 factors. It's similar to, but not synonymous with, the scam model. First, the vulnerability. That's the same as susceptibility. But the second one is very important: apparent authority. Apparent authority means I have stepped into a role that has some authority with the older adult. That could be formal. I could become their power of attorney. But a lot of times it's not formal. I just say I'm their power of attorney, and nobody really asks me. They're just glad at the hospital to have somebody to talk to. I can't tell you how many times it's been a neighbor or a caregiver that's scamming an older adult, and you look at the hospital records, daughter, wife, it's that same person, it's that caregiver who's misrepresenting themselves. Okay, so apparent authority. Actions or tactics used. So you see, you really can't go and interview an older adult and really get a sense of undue influence, because they aren't aware of how they're being manipulated. So you're going to have to get a lot of indirect evidence. And in California, they also look at equity of the result. That's a good place to start, right? I've known the older person's known a caregiver for 8 months, and now they're getting 80% of the inheritance. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So the equity of the result is important, and the courts care a lot about equity of the result. Let me give you a case study, and it kind of calls out some of these. And Paul mentioned probate. I do a lot of work in the probate courts, including in this case, and I'm always flabbergasted. These are where some of the worst cases of financial exploitation come to light. But I have almost never, just a couple of times, seen a judge call up a prosecutor and say, hey, let me turn over this evidence to you. This gentleman was married 57 years when he was widowed. 3 years after the death, he met a woman 10 years younger. And we heard yesterday from Kim about the vulnerability of widowhood. And you know, we all have to remember this is also these kinds of intimate relationships are a primary need. Friends don't replace that. It's just not how that works. So people are looking for other relationships. And this was a Match.com. She was not that young, but she was younger than him. So they start a relationship, and this, quote, devout Catholic lady has sexual relationships with him on his second date, which I termed a tactic because this was going to change over time. His health began to deteriorate, susceptibility. She started breaking up with him multiple times. So that really increased his dependence on her emotionally and totally destroyed his self-esteem and his sense of continuity. At one point then, she started to take over making sure he got his medications and communicating with the doctor. She had stepped into that role of apparent authority. And she poisoned his relationship with his children. Probably the most devoted children I've ever met. And the most patient. She made him choose between her and his rotten kids. So she married him, but only after she found out that he had terminal cancer, and then told him that he was mistaken. He didn't have terminal cancer. And then she got busy on making all the accounts joint, and then on the day that he died, taking all that and putting it into her own account. So when we did the analysis, and here's a bit of advice for all of us, because these kids did it right. You know, contemporary documentation that is at the same time contemporaneous as the events is so powerful. The son and daughter started keeping a journal on their own. They never told each other about it until after he died. And the details from that were exceptionally helpful, especially when she was on the stand, sort of say, oh yeah, maybe we broke up once, and they had documented dates, times, you know, the 12 breakups, throwing him out of the house in the middle of the night, where he came back to their house having soiled himself because he had dementia and had other problems. But look at these functional things. Because nobody had evaluated him for dementia. But I had no problem going on the stand and talking about it. He couldn't administer his medications. Okay, that's one of those functional declines, cognitive impairment. He got sick with pneumonia and he didn't know to go to the hospital. His judgment about his condition. He lost his insurance and Social Security cards, his memory, and he forgot his children's birthday. The documentation was so extensive that while I was on the stand when we came to lunch break, the lady called it quits. And I tell you, the attorney that was working on the case was brilliant. She was the plaintiff's attorney. She put the lady on the stand first. I got to come after her. And they quit. They gave everything back. One of those rare cases where, hey, that afternoon, the kids took a truck over and got all their material, all their possessions back, their father's, and also the bank accounts. So we've been focusing a lot on this issue of financial exploitation, financial capacity, and Alzheimer's disease, which is often hidden, which is often never evaluated by anybody. There may be notes, like in this gentleman before that I just talked about. His oncologist noted that he was having trouble tracking some information, but that was it. So especially in the earlier stages, this may never be documented. Now, if you were to go to a psychologist and say, okay, I need this person assessed, they'll use Dan Marston's framework. And Dan does brilliant work. He's been doing it for 20 years at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. And basically, those are the 8 domains of financial competency. And Dan's an attorney and a psychologist, neuropsychologist, and he's created this measure. You know, do you know basic monetary things? Can you write out a check? Can you balance a checkbook? So forth. And he promises there'll be an online version at some point as well. But there's no actual conversation, interview about the decision that's being made. So there's nothing that says for this specific decision, which legal questions are always capacity for what? What was a person's capacity? And in Dan's case, because his work really was in cognitive decline, neurological impairment, especially in Alzheimer's disease, none of the non-cognitive factors were included in any of his scales. If you read some of his more recent work, he's starting to come around. And Dan's a good friend of mine, I think that some of our work has kind of helped in that regard. This is what informed decision making is all about. Applebaum and Grisseau codified this 30 years ago. Why? Because guardianship laws changed. As Erica Wood from the ABA says, guardianship is the big kahuna. Everything else about capacity follows guardianship. And guardianship laws changed. It used to be if you had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, had a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, I could take that documentation into court and become your guardian. But the mental health sort of revolution changed that. Self-determination, and these tests became functional. And the functional test is, can you make informed decisions? What's an informed decision? Can you communicate your choice, an understanding of that choice, an appreciation of the potential consequences of that choice, and can you reason? And is that choice, is the rationale not something of a delusion? So we set out to create a person-centered approach to financial capacity assessment. And this was our first publication. Briefly, person-centeredness is really about respect and honoring the older person in front of you, especially if they have cognitive impairment. Understanding that they're more than the sum of their cognitive abilities. People bring their whole lives into decision making. Somebody who's been an executive all their life is going to be much more comfortable, say, in naming who they want to be their power of attorney or even their guardian than somebody who's never handled finances at all. Traditional approaches overemphasize deficits. When you have a cognitive impairment and you take Dan's test, you fail pretty miserably most of the time because it's new information. It's not something that's in your life, well learned and integrated. And Applebaum and Grisso actually are the ones who showed this when they did medical decision-making capacity research. If they gave you a vignette about surgery or management of a chronic condition, you did much worse if you had some cognitive impairment than if they asked you about your own diabetes, your own high cholesterol, your own issues. So asking people about the actual decision really helps not overestimate their deficit. And it's always important to get the story from the person with dementia, the person who's making the decision. As I mentioned yesterday, the key question in elder justice is where do you promote autonomy? Where do you provide protection? If there was no harm in overprotecting everybody, that would be a great way to do it. Just throw the net over and keep everybody close. But it turns out there's considerable harm, and that it even can, it's not just quality of life, but it might even be longevity that's harmed by overprotecting people when they don't need it. We use the same concept mapping model that Ken Conrad and colleagues used. As a matter of fact, we hired Ken and his colleague Mickey Irish to lead us in it. And we had 2 expert panels, including Dan Morrison, six who were engaged in capacity assessment, national experts, and 14 who were local that worked with older adults and their finances on a regular basis. Financial services, social services, adult protective services. We had a great group of people, aging network, etc. And they helped us create a new conceptual model for financial decision making that we could measure, and also a final list of items for the scale. This was the conceptual model that we all came up with. Those intellectual factors in the middle, that is informed decision making, Applebaum and Grisso. That we knew was key. But these contextual variables can sometimes overwhelm those intellectual factors. Financial awareness, psychological vulnerability, and susceptibility to undue influence or exploitation. And what we're looking at is the integrity of the financial decision-making abilities. So we're not looking at do they make a good decision, bad decision, but do they make one that is an informed decision. So let me tell you about a very interesting, difficult case. This was an 82-year-old divorced retiree. His net worth was about $12 million, and mostly it was in properties. He got tangled up with romance scams, 2 different women who want to marry him. Of course, he'd never met these women, and most of their pictures come from X-rated magazines. You can find the pictures that were sent on various websites. But it was clever because there was an inheritance twist. They got his entrepreneurial spirit into this. Not only could he have these beautiful women, and they adored him, wanted to marry him, they talked to him all the time on the phone, but they needed him because in their country, you couldn't inherit the $15 million unless you were married. But of course, there's all kinds of fees that have to happen before he could get to them. And he lost several $100,000 to the attorneys, quote unquote. Finally, he drives 1,000 miles to go look for one of the wives. And basically, he ran into a state trooper. I mean, he literally ran into a state trooper car and ended up in the hospital. So I was called in to do an evaluation on this gentleman. His cognitive aspects were fascinating. He was exceptionally smart. As a matter of fact, on his performance IQ, he was in the top 3%. He was in the top 1%. So you would say, hey, no cognitive problems there. His memory was good too. Very high functioning. But he did have executive functioning deficit, and he had quite a bit of paranoia. And see, those scammers were really good at that confidential relationship and saying, your kids just want you dead. Look at all you've achieved. Now they just want to put you in a home, get you killed off, inherit your money. And when you're getting told that round the clock, because he really wasn't sleeping, he was getting phone calls all the time, and you've got kind of a sliver in there, you can start to believe it. But the impact is what really helped me drive a wedge in this case, because cognitively really wasn't too bad. However, he was no longer paying his taxes. He was so consumed with this that his beautiful house almost foreclosed. His kids came in the last minute and saved it. He was actually broke, and he admitted that to me at the time. I interviewed him. He wasn't sleeping. He had rotted food in the fridge and so forth. And he basically said, look, I want to do this, let me do it. So he had that strong sense of autonomy. His kids were great. They took him not only to the bank president sat down, talked to him about all this, but they took him to an FBI agent who showed him that the birth certificates sent by the wives were phony. It did not crack him. He was sure that his millions were there. So you don't have to raise your hand on this, but the probate case. Did he meet the standards for limited guardianship and conservatorship? And what kinds of independence would he still be able to have? These were the questions that were really in front of us. Out of our work, we came up with the financial decision screening scale, also known on our website as the financial decision tracker. These 10 items really get at those 4 aspects of informed decision making, plus whether this is an autonomous decision or somebody else's. And we've been doing a little bit of research on this. And the first question that we asked is there any empirical evidence for our supposition about this intersection between faulty financial decision making and cases of substantiated financial exploitation or financial incapacity? And here's how we studied it. We actually had about half the cases were from Adult Protective Services, and they either substantiated or did not substantiate the claim of exploitation. And about half the cases were from attorneys, financial planners, CPAs, and social workers. And they were looking at, does this person have capacity or not? And so the scores that I'm going to show you are really kind of risk scores. So the substantiated score on the APS cases was a higher risk score than the not substantiated, and the places where the professionals were concerned about capacity had a higher risk score than not concerned. So we felt like we had some preliminary evidence that yes, indeed, this intersection of decision-making deficits and exploitation certainly has a place. We followed that up with this study, which was much more comprehensive, added another 100 individuals, and hired, our consultant was Jeannie Teresi from Columbia, one of the foremost statisticians on scale development. And she did her wizardry, whatever it is she does, and just for fun, I'll show you what she did. First of all, there's our sample. And this is what she did. Now, if you can explain this to me, please join our team. You'll be my next statistician when Jeannie retires. But basically, it looks at, do all the scale items matter, and are they internally consistent? Do they go together? Are they measuring one factor? Yes, they were measuring decision-making abilities. So we moved on. This says how good of a predictor was the scale, and that line was about 0.86, which is actually pretty darn good. So we felt confident in moving ahead with that. Yes, I need to, yes, sorry, Paul. Everybody else stole my time, so sorry. I'm taking a little bit of theirs. No, I'm sorry, Paul. I promised him I'd keep it to half an hour, but you know how it is. Let me just say one thing then about how we use this scale with a prosecutor. I've been doing some pro bono work for prosecutors in Michigan, and this was a potential unjust enrichment. And this gentleman had loaned money over the years to his brothers and his nieces. He was very meticulous about his record keeping. No more than $3,000. They had an account when they paid it back and so forth. So he was a generous guy, but careful. He had to retire because of his cognitive impairment. And a little bit after that, he was almost a sweepstakes scam victim. The wife called the brother, or nefarious brother, and said, hey, keep him from going to claim his sweepstake ticket. And he did. So he knew that his brother had dementia. He lived down the road from him, saw him all the time. But he couldn't help himself. He took his brother, took the impaired brother to the bank, got him to withdraw $100,000 to pay off his mortgage, and the prosecutor charged him with unjust enrichment. And this will be my last slide. What we found was memory and executive functioning deficits. His functioning was very stable, and so we knew that this was very much like what he was when the crime occurred. And he didn't understand or appreciate how much risk he was putting himself in and how much he was hurting his own financial position. Also, with the undue influence aspect, you want to look at deception. The brother never told the wife, the caregiver, about what he was doing with her husband. And she only found out about it when the statement came. And so his lack of awareness, his minimization of deficit, all the deception, susceptibility, confidential relationship, we concluded he was indeed, the man was a victim of unjust enrichment. And the prosecutor was thrilled that a couple days before trial, the man plea bargained and pled guilty and basically compensated his brother back for $100,000. So I thank you very much for letting me share some of our journey with you today.